All right, so thank you to everyone who could not get tickets to Raphael's Cobalt Strike class. I appreciate you being here. My name is Steve Aiello, and I will be talking about building securable infrastructures. So before I start, I kind of like to get to know my audience a little bit, so I want to ask a couple of questions. How many people here work in the security space proper? Like, that's how you get paid, like that's what your paycheck is from. Wow, a lot of you. Okay. It's more than I expected. So how many are sysadmins that are also responsible for security in their environment? Oh man, this is like totally not applicable to like 90%. Well, hopefully you will have something to talk about for the people that you work with. And actually, I hope that you will really take something away from this, because it's very, very important. How many people, when they decided to get into IT, said, I'm going to go to college, and I'm going to take classes, or I'm going to do, cough, cough, MCSE, and get a useless piece of paper. How many of you decided, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to school for this, and that's how you started? Okay, that's about what I expected. And how many said, I really like computers, and you started tinkering around, and you got some books, and you eventually found work because you were the computer guy or girl? How many did that? Okay, so pretty significant number. Okay, I'm kind of surprised. So a little bit about me. I've been doing this for a long time. This is my three most recent. I've been doing IT work seriously as an admin for almost 17 years. I started off right basically when I was out of high school. But my career took a real big turn in my three last positions. One was this company called Focus One Data. And essentially, we had financial and healthcare data. So, anything PCI, banking, and healthcare, this company had it. And it was a really small company. It was out in Dearborn. If you ever need to do debt collection letter printing for medical procedures that the people had to do, this is the company that did it. And so we had and HIPAA was really coming in onto the scene in this time period, right? It wasn't HIPAA high tech. It was like old school HIPAA, where you just they hoped you were doing something. But the company that I worked for took it very seriously. So they sent me to a lot of training right away. And I learned a lot about the HIPAA space. And it was a really wonderful place to be able to learn and grow. And I was the Windows guy. I was the Cisco guy. I managed all of our firewall. Probably like a lot of you, you're wearing many, many hats. And that's what I did there. And then I worked at ADP. Does anybody here work for ADP? God's shithole. Like, that place is like China or whoever, pick your nation state of choice. So ADP does 74% of the world's payroll in some way, shape, or form. According to the Navy, they do the Navy's payroll, thereby the Marines, the Army, the Air Force. How long before our armed service members are going to stop taking bullets if their wives aren't getting paychecks? It's a very, very interesting space there. But since I was the only one who really knew anything about compliance when I moved to ADP, they were like, well, you know about compliance, and we have this stuff. Like, it was Sarbanes-Oxley back then. Now it's all the different SAS stuff. SAS 70 and ISO 27000. I got not stuck. I actually ended up really liking it. I got to work with our auditors, KPMG and Deloitte & Touche. And so I worked with our security team there, and we essentially, there was no real good SIM product back in 2004. There was no real good log aggregation log analytics packages back then. So I wrote one. And that's what I did for my first 4 years at ADP. It started off at about 15,000 servers and scaled out to about 60,000 servers. And every week, we dumped every single log from every single Linux, Unix, and Windows server in our environment. I imported it into a massive SQL database. I worked with our DBA team to write time-based queries to look for certain events of interest. And at the end of the week, it spit us out a report of actionable items, and then we would go and investigate those items. And I got I was really proud of it. D&T said it was a great system. It was totally custom. And then we had a reorg, and they were like, nope, corporate's going to do this, and you're going to be a regular system admin again. And I was like, oh, you guys suck, because it wasn't really very fun. I supported a lot of Java apps, right? If any of your HR people use ADP, I know 100% assuredly you have Java running on the computers with your most sensitive data on it. I guarantee it, because I supported all their products. Now I work at a company called Online Tech, and we focus mostly in the PCI and HIPAA space. I've been there for about 18 months, very cool company. And we're kind of, we're not really like a rack space, we're kind of like an operating system as a service company. And we'll do like AV, we'll do log review for you. So if you have projects and you're like, listen, we need to stand up a massive VMware environment. We need an environment, don't quote me on this because I'll get in trouble, but we need an environment and we need to be able to turn up 500 machines. It needs to be private hardware. We need to, be HIPAA compliant, PCI compliant, whatever it is. SAN infrastructure, whether it's EqualLogic, EMC, Blade, whatever, we're a Dell shop, and we need to do it in like 30 days. And you don't want to spend $1 million in CapEx, we'll amortize, we'll spread that out for you. It's a really cool company. And we've got about 50 people, and it's like we just, had Symmetrics, which is wicked awesome to play with, which is also a security vulnerability. I'm going to talk about it. So I've always been in the data center space. Minus focus one. I've always been in really, really big environments, thousands and thousands of servers. And you run into some really hard challenges in these spaces. So, does it work? Maybe I'm too far. Okay. So this is all the crap that really nobody cares about. Apparently Eve doesn't like any of the certs. I don't know if she's here. Yes, I have my CISSP. I actually do think it's valuable. I learned a lot. If you have the technical knowledge already for what they're trying to teach you. If you don't have the technical knowledge and you're a pen tester or an offensive person, that cert is worthless. I do have my CISA. If you do your CISSP, I don't even really recommend studying. You can just go pass it. I have my GSAC. I'm a huge VMware guy. I do not work for VMware, but I do suckle at the teat of VMware. I think it's a great product. And I started off my career as a network guy, but all my network guys kind of tease me. They're like, oh, it's expired. You did it. You did it when it was Cat OS. And I'm like, yeah, shit was hard. And I have some other certs that nobody really cares about. All right. Whenever I do a presentation, and Ben, are you still here? Oh, man, Ben is not in the room. That sucks. Okay. Whenever I do a presentation, I really like to start off with a quote. And my great concern is not whether you have failed, but whether you are content with your failure. Abraham Lincoln. And if you know anything about the Civil War, the North was not doing very well in the beginning of the Civil War. It was looking very, very bleak until they got their act together. And that's where I think the state of computer security is today. It's very, very bleak. And so this is, and when I saw this on Ben's slide, I'm like, oh, dude, you suck. So in my opinion, what do Febreze and IT security have in common? It's not that IT security stinks, but we cover up a lot of stuff that stinks. Systems engineers proper do not know how to engineer. They don't. If you walk into an environment large and you go up to the dude with engineer or woman with engineer in his title and you ask him or her how he got there, essentially it was he just had enough time and he's lived or she's lived, they've done enough projects and they've just got now the word engineer in their title because they hit a certain pay grade and they had to make and put them in a new position. And I think that that's a big, big problem. And apparently there's some really smart people that agree with me. So this would actually, I am kind of an academic. So this came out May 24th. And this was an article I'm trying to remember where I read this. I have the link, I can give it to you. But there was an interview with SourceFire and FireEye. You guys probably know them. Vormetric is an encryption-based company. And Brocade, who is a SAN fabric switching company, right? Their infrastructure. And I thought this was really interesting. He said, we've tried to make the devices more secure by putting AV on them, by putting controls in the network that prevent breaches. And the fact is, the bad guys just figure out ways around them, right? Of the $60 billion that the industry spends on IT security, they detect 1 in 20 compromised devices. Right? Oh, it's on the register. There you go. So $60 billion a year we're spending on this stuff. $60 billion we are spending on computer security. We have rampant security breaches, and we're only able to detect 5% of when this happens. This is like failure. I mean, that's not even like a D- in school if you get a 5% in your class. Now, to put this into perspective, the NFL, right, makes $6 billion a year. So we're spending 10 times what the NFL spends on this stuff, and we A, have a ton of breaches, and B, when we do get breached, we can only detect it 5% of the time. This, to me, is a problem. So I've actually been thinking about this talk for a really long time, and I've wanted to do it. So when Wolfgang approached me about talking to BSides, or actually I think one of our marketing people asked me if I want to present here, I said, yeah, absolutely. And I've been thinking about this talk since 2011. And I'm a huge Bruce Schneier fan. He's just amazing. But you rarely ever hear him talk about technical things other than crypto. But one of the things that he did, this is a TEDx talk, and I'll give you all these URLs, because it's a phenomenal talk. He did it in 2010, but it was posted in 2011. And Schneier was talking about the feeling of security. And security is a trade-off between feeling secure, and you can feel like you're secure but not, and you can be secure and not know it. And I think that this is something that is a systemic issue with our industry. We buy products, we buy software, appliances that make our executives, that make us feel secure. We can quantify, we spent $70,000 on an Imperva WAF. It's a WAF. There's a box there, we can touch it, we can point to it. That makes us more secure. Spend 70 grand on a firewall, IDS, IPS solution, right? We can see it, we can touch it, it's downloading the signatures from somewhere, and it's making us feel more secure. But $60 billion that we're spending and a very, very low success rate, I would say we're not really more secure. Maybe we just feel more secure. Then there was another one. This is really what got me thinking in the line that I've been thinking. Last year I went to DEF CON 20. It's the first time ever there. Really, really good. And there was one gentleman's presentation that really stood out to me. And he was a coder for the NSA. And he was talking about, is a phenomenal talk. Again, I would absolutely recommend that you watch it. And let me kind of say this. I hope this talk makes you think differently about designing infrastructures. This is what my objective is. So hopefully you go out after after this talk, and you watch all these things and think differently about IT infrastructure. And what he was talking about is this was the first A1 security kernel. It was a whole operating system. So how many everybody close your eyes so you won't make fun of the CISSPs. How many CISSPs are in here? There's a couple. Who else knows what an A1 rating is in the common criteria and why that's impressive for an operating system? So an A1 evaluated product means that your product has to operate, it has to begin in a secure state, it has to operate and even fail in a secure state. So it's like, this is open source. It's called KSOS. It's the operating system that runs the nuclear missile silos, the nuclear subs, right? And mathematically, this wicked smart gentleman, amazing, he was working at Sony right when they were like getting owned over and over and over. It was pretty funny. But he said, this is open source. It was a complete operating system that fit into like 32K of memory, and they went through the mathematical proofs to guarantee that the operating system was never insecure. Very different than how we design and think about and conceptualize our networks. We accept insecurity, and we try these bolt-on products after the fact to compensate for our accepted insecurity, and that's a problem, right? That's a problem. So I started thinking about this, and I went to Securable in 2012. I was on a panel there, and I started asking all these software vendors, because I just got back from DEF CON, and I'm like, man, this guy's wicked smart. Like, he wrote a legitimately secure operating system. Like, that's really impressive to me. So I started asking the vendors there. I said, what's the least privilege on my systems that I can run your software with? And these are security vendors. And they're like, well, yeah, if you run the management interface, you really need to run it as administrator. So let me see a problem with that, right? What's your policy on application availability due to OS patching? How many of you here have worked in a company and you've had a really critical application and your software vendor says, oh, no, you cannot patch your OS. We do not support that. You have to wait until we tell you you can patch your OS. That's a problem. That's a problem. Do your products require Adobe or Java plugins for your management interface? Nessus, what the heck? Why are you written in Flash? Right? And I'm talking to all these security vendors, and I'm asking, what is your management interface written in for your firewall? Every single one of them, except Tripwire, said Java or Adobe Flash. Why would I buy your product? Ridiculous. And then finally, what two-factor solutions does your product integrate with? Two factors, I mean, you have to have it nowadays. It's ridiculous. So I started thinking about all this stuff, and I was like, man, we are in a really bad spot. Really, really bad spot as infrastructure engineers. I'm an infrastructure guy, but I care deeply about security. And I went over for an interview with a pretty well-known security team in the area. And it was a security job proper. And they said, we would really like to hire you, but how would you feel not building? A lot of guys like you like to build, you like to create things. And I said, well, I don't know. How's your relationship with your infrastructure team? And they looked at me with deer eyes, like they had no idea what I was talking about. If you don't have the concept of building insecurity from the start, your security programs will fail, right? But there are people, generally the government, because they have very high stakes, that think about these things differently. And we, as a community, as infrastructure, as engineers, we need to start thinking about things differently. And I think that we've seen this because of basically three problems. One, we have a horrible education track for infrastructure people. It's horrible. And we're going to do a little bit of comparison. We don't understand or care to understand business needs. And this is big. This is very, very big. And because of this, in most commercial environments, security is an afterthought. Because we don't have the knowledge up front. We're not trained to think of how to protect the business. We're very reactionary. And we need to stop this trend. We need to stop this trend. So I want to take a look at the definition of a software engineer, because there's a lot of traction now about developing better software, right? There's a lot of SQL code injection, command injection. This is, other than the phishing attacks and the human element that Ben talked about, this is where you're getting a lot of the vulnerabilities. Windows is not as bad as it used to be, right? So software engineering is the application of systematic, disciplined, quantifiable approach to design, development, operation, and maintenance of software. And the study of these approaches, right? It's the application of engineering principles into software development. Let's look at, it's pretty reasonable. Let's look at a civil or structural engineer. Let's look at what they do. College for the structural engineering student consists of math, statistics, dynamics, conceptual structural design, materials engineering, engineering graphics, computer-aided design, and structural analysis. So very different than what infrastructure people do. Design of structures with each of the so you're evaluating the structures with each of the commonly used construction materials are explored. So steel, concrete, composites. They can't just study the design, what their building needs to look like. They need to study the materials that make up their design. Frank Lloyd Wright, brilliant architect, horrible structural engineer. Falling water would have fallen over long ago. If you're into history, the civil engineers actually had to add steel reinforcement beams into falling water because the design would just not stand up. We've got a lot of Frank Lloyd Wrights out there. Not a lot of good structural engineers. And this is very important, I'm actually really glad Eve touched on this. Among the core classes at any university, students find that they are required to study English, right? Where this may not seem important to the engineering student, it in fact is very important. A lot of the structural engineer's product is drawings and reports. The ability to write clearly and concisely is an important skill to have in the engineer's tool set. I have met highly paid engineers who cannot construct a sentence at the level of a fifth grader. And this is why we don't get respect from the business units in our organizations. This is why we don't get buy-ins from our CEOs, because we can't communicate with them. And this is a problem. So I took my first security proper class in 2002, and these were the two books I got. And I was like, who the fuck is this Bruce Schneier guy? So what book did I read, and what book did I never read? I read this book, and I never opened this book. But these guys, they're still around, right? This guy, hopefully everybody in this room knows who he is. Very different. We're not thinking conceptually in how to build our networks from the ground up stronger. And because we have these ideas, right, and these mental models that exist in our perceptions of our work, we have cool jobs and we have lame jobs, right? Everybody's like, yo, dude, I'm a pen tester. I'll pop your box. Like, this is basically how it is, right? They made a movie called Hackers. They didn't make a movie about the patch management engineer. I mean, this is totally serious. Or the guys that are like, I do the IDS, IPS, I run the honeypots, I do IR. I mean, like, even a QSA is kind of cooler than an auditor, right? We build these perceptions about what the value of our jobs are. But the most important things, before you ever get to any of this, you better be doing these three things. Because if you're not logging and know how to turn on logs proper in Windows or in Linux, well, none of your IR guys aren't going to have anything to look at, right? If you're not patching, then don't bother hiring a pen tester, because if you've had some old exploit, if you got Java code running, why bother? You know it's there. If you're not doing backups, you can't do a forensic analysis. You can't recover the data that you lost because, you weren't doing these other things. But we make value judgments on this type of work. And generally, we give it to the lowest dude on the totem pole. We try to get out of that position as quickly as possible, and we view it as lame. And that's a problem, right? That's a big problem. So the result of all this is we have a lack of uniform design principles because our infrastructure engineers are not taught design, right? We are not taught how to evaluate vendors. We have zero to poor documentation. If we do develop standards, and kudos to you if you have actually gone past what most, we have a hard time following our own standards. And When we design environments, I almost never hear anybody go, okay, well, how are we going to design this environment to maintain it? How are we going to do backups in it? That's generally an afterthought. And this is systemic of 15 years working with lots of different companies. And we work with outside companies. I see this all the time. This is why you all have jobs, all of you security proper people. So how do we fix this, right? How do we find solutions? We need to change our strategy, and we need to change our tactics. And hopefully as security professionals, you can go back to the admins that are working in your environment, and you can start talking to them about changing strategy and changing tactics. First, education. It's poor. It's very poor. If you want to get buy-in from your management, if you want to understand why your management is doing things, pick up Financial Statements for Dummies. It's a book that I bought, and I learned how to read financial statements and the crazy, wicked decisions that our CEOs would make, and I totally didn't understand it. Once I looked at a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet, and I understood the difference between CapEx and OpEx, you sitting here are so much more expensive than a $70,000 a year firewall. And if someone sends you to $15,000 worth of SANS training, right, you can walk out the door and you will probably get a big, fat, juicy pay raise at your next company. And this is how executives think. And this is why we are in this, I'm going to buy an appliance, I'm going to buy some software mentality. Understand it. Leverage it. I've talked to our HR person. There is a term called flight risk. Are we going to invest in this person, in our company, if we perceive them as a flight risk? It means they worry about your loyalty to the company. And if they dump $10,000 in training in you, you could probably walk out the door and make $20,000 a year more somewhere else. That's how businesses think. Know it, understand it, use it to your advantage. Learn to write well. My grammar is not great. My commas and semicolons are appalling. I'm working on it. And learn how to write an executive summary. We get really excited. This is the place for me to come and talk about for an hour about all these things that I really love and I'm really excited about. Our CEO will say, you have 10 words to explain to me what I need to do. 10 words. If we are in a critical situation, we got hit with a DDoS, 3 words. We're under attack. And he said, I understand that. Do what you need to do. This is important. Business people don't think like we think. And if we want to be successful, if we want to get the respect, if we want to make this an established, well-regarded profession like a lawyer or a doctor or an accountant, professions that have been around, if we want to elevate the status of our job, we need to understand this. Else we will be outsourced, we will be laid off to the intern that comes out of college. There's value in experience. There's value in the learning process. But many of us never get to this point, and that's a problem. So, the point about the civil engineer that has to learn to evaluate materials. How many of you have one of these products in your environment? Show of hands. Come on. There you go. I know all of you have, for sure, Adobe or Java in your environment. What does that mean? That means that attack vector that Ben was trying to guard, it's exploitable. And this is essentially what we're doing when we accept these vendors into our environments. We're building a house of cards. We're setting ourselves up for failure. Yes, the user training is phenomenal. I believe in it. That one of the happiest days at work was when our payroll lady called me and she said, Steve, I need to show you this. There's this thing, and it was like, when you RDP into something and it's like not a true cert and it goes, this has not been verified. She's like, and I was like, oh man, that's awesome. User training is important, but we need to not accept the types of infrastructures that we're building. And this strategy problem is a big deal. So I remember this, it came out on my birthday on 2011. 99.8, it was like an 18-month analysis that they did. 99.8% of all virus and malware infections were caused by either Adobe or Oracle via Java. 99.8. It's a big freaking number. And I'm not proposing, what's his face from Paul.com, Asadorian, was like, you can't say that companies need to get rid of Java. You're right, you can't. But you need to design for that, right? Did you know that civil engineers need to be licensed in different states? You cannot be a licensed civil engineer in Michigan and just go out to California and practice. Why? Anybody? What is different about the environment? This is something real specific. Absolutely. You're on a fault line, right? The environment is different. How you design structures in Michigan will be taking into fact cold, salt, right? Climate. Environment in California, earthquake. True, yeah, I guess that's true. Vector-based analysis. How many of you use this? You're security professionals. How many use vector-based analysis? Couple. You got some good people. It's good. Vector-based analysis is the way that offender will get to your data. If you're doing vector-based analysis, you have to look at what you're protecting. We're not protecting networks. We're not protecting hosts. We're not protecting applications. We are protecting data. Does a Cisco 6500 with no data flowing over it mean anything? No. Does a Windows server, well, I mean, it could be used as a botnet, but is a Windows host with no data on it worth anything? No, not really. Is an application with no data in it worth anything? No. We're protecting data. This is a very, very important concept. Our networks are so big. How do we find where all of our data is? True story. OSI model. Every single person I interview to work with us, I ask them about the OSI model. And networking has been successful because the OSI model was designed to make big problems appear small. You deal with it one piece at a time. And that's why we have networking. That's why we have the successes that we do, right? But a lot of people don't do this, right? I do a lot of BCDR stuff. And the thing that I see over and over and over, whether it's for a bank, whether it's for a commercial organization, whether it's for a college, people have no idea what they're protecting. They've got no clue. I've seen people, would go through the analysis of servers and we're, okay, well, what are we going to do for you? What do we need to make sure that's online with a certain RTO, RPO? And they'll be like, well, we've got this open SMTP relay server that we need to make sure is in our BCDR plan. I'm like, is it open relay server for your customers internally? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, what data's on that? And they're like, oh, nothing. It's just a relay server that we have. And I'm like, why is that in your DR plan? You can have an intern come in and stand one up in 15 minutes. It doesn't make any sense. They have no clue what they're protecting. Same thing. There was a bank I was working with. It was a file server. There was also part of another company's BCDR plan, and they're like, this is a huge terabyte file server, had tons and tons of records on it, and I start going through the data to evaluating what directories actually need to be backed up. And there's gigs of the HR lady's Christmas photos. I'm like, oh, and that's cool. If you want to give your people a place to store personal files, that's awesome. Cool for you, man. Not on the finance server. Because now there's 800 gigs of data when the little freaking finance files are 50 gigs. It's ridiculous. But people aren't classifying their data. And the same thing. There's a bank, there's a mortgage, I won't say too much. There's a bank, and they had NTFS corruption on their file system. And it was a 2 point something terabyte server. And this was the file server that housed 40 years worth of mortgage documents. Every check was scanned in. You know, banks have very stringent requirements, and this was the place. And I'm like, okay, where on the file server, and they needed certain things restored quickly to conduct business. I said, where on the file server are your most critical information assets? And they're like, oh, we don't know. Each department kind of has their own folder, and they put stuff kind of in their folder. We don't really know what the folder structure is. If you're not classifying your data, if you're not managing where that data goes, you can't be successful. Or if you are successful, it's going to cost you so much more than it needs to. And this is where I do think things like the CISSP come into play. The military does this. If you're a commercial organization, you have sensitive data, you have confidential data, you have private, proprietary, and public data. Where is my budget going to protect your data? Here? No. Why? It's public. I don't need to ensure the confidentiality of that data. I need to ensure the integrity and the availability of that data. It's different. Up here, sensitive. I need to ensure the confidentiality of that data and the integrity of that data. Should not be available to everyone. This is where, if you are an already technical person, understanding these concepts, understanding these strategies, if you apply them, is useful. If you're a pen tester, you don't care about this. You hope I don't know about this. Very, very different mindset, right? Other industries do this. The first time I ever did a business continuity and disaster recovery talk, it was for a supply chain management organization. IT is a very immature industry as far as history goes. Accountants have been going back a long ways, right? People have been working with money for a long time. Structural engineers, been around the glory days of the Romans, right? Who remembers flying buttresses in your Western Civ class, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about. You're smiling, so at least I know I got one person. IT is a new industry. But there are other industries where it is unacceptable to map the flow of your business. If you're a supply chain organization and you're Walmart, you need to know where every single product comes in from, how it's going to funnel through your organization, and how it's going to be presented to your end user. It's unacceptable not to know that. It has to be unacceptable for infrastructure engineers and security professionals to not know how data flows through their network. And most don't. And what also needs to be unacceptable is that we don't guide lovingly, not as a jerk, as Ben pointed out, how that data flows through our network. My better half, she went to school for supply chain. She has her MBA. I learned a lot about IT from mature careers. There's no wonder why auditors are our IT auditors as well as financial auditors. They're methodical. They're precise. They're trained to look at small irregularities. That's what our IR people are. They're methodical. They're precise. They're looking for small irregularities that mean something bigger. We have to turn and look and see what we can get from people that have been doing this stuff for a long time. So what do we need to do, right? Strategy perspective. We basically can break down what should be going on in our network, who, what, where, when, why. Maybe the whys aren't ever going to be available to us. But we need to know our authorized and unauthorized users, that's the who. What they're doing is accessing data. Where they're at is either on our networks or physical access, and when can we define some time-based policies. Temporal control is an amazingly powerful tool. And I don't know hardly anybody that uses it. I use it in my personal things. I've had some customers that have let me implement it for them. Actually works very, very well for certain banks when you have jobs that are very traditional, 9 to 5. Temporal-based policies are very, very effective. I want you to look at two things. Your Cisco ACLs, how many people, sorry, Steph, your marketing department walks out at 4:59 every day? Thank you. One person's honest. Steph is in our marketing department. Most people, there are certain departments, they have very steady start and stop times. If you're worried about data exfiltration, your DLP system, why do you allow traffic out of those subnets after close of business hours? Time-based ACLs in Cisco, you can say our working hours are, let's say, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The ACL, if it doesn't match that time window, no traffic's going anywhere. Do you allow printers to go out to the internet? Amazing article in Dark Reading about data exfiltration running over printers. You can't AV that stuff. There's no patches for it. I've been watching printers for a long time. Got a nice little web interface for you, fully functioning TCP/IP stack. Hacker delight, man. Why can those get to the internet? Never. Never, never, never. Shut things down. Tell people, go home. It's called work-life balance, and you're helping my security posture. If you want to go home, take your laptop home. We do a lot of bring your own devices. I think everybody does. Get off my network. If you have workstations or traditional, even easier. Assigning login hours to Windows. This is huge. This is huge. Right? If you know that in general, your employees should not be logging into HR, financial, healthcare, medical information outside of business windows, this is free. This is free. Cisco time-based ACLs are free. Know what you have. I'm going to skip these slides. I didn't know how I would be on time. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to take you through how I look at things when I try to design securable infrastructures. And it's a work in progress. And there's been some people that have kind of not totally go full bore as I've wanted to with this, but I've got to do some of this, and it's been pretty fun. So people are familiar with N-tier architecture, right? It's like, are people familiar with N-tier architecture? Okay. N-tier architecture, I didn't get a whole lot of hands. So you have your web farm. There's really no general data that sits on your web farm. It's a front-end server. You have your application server, and you have either app or data. We'll do 2 tiers here. And then this is something that I put in because I thought it was fun. And I'll explain it. So in a web server, I work working at ADP, there was no data that's held in the web farm. All the data is either in a consolidated app and database tier, or you have an app and database tier, right? And in this architecture, you have your firewall in front, you have your firewall in between the tiers, we do have a WAF, and we have some really expensive IDSs, IPSs, but I'm not that impressed with them because they're just a tool. And then I'm going to introduce the concept of a response server, and I love VMware. And I'll explain why I love VMware. So in this environment, we actually do have our users that can never, ever access this at all. Never. They have to VPN in with two-factor authentication. They have a kind of like a deployment server, you could think about it, and everything is pushed from behind forward. No access other than very, very restricted is ever allowed here. No access is ever allowed here, and no access from the internet is ever allowed here. Now, there's some conceptual problems that I'm going to talk about in how to do things like patching and so on and so forth. So what we're using is we're going to use a combination of technologies. So Cisco, private VLANs. There was somebody said that the Windows Trust folks were talking about private VLANs. So who knows what private VLANing is in Cisco? It's free. No? The concept of private VLANing is really quite powerful. So you can put all of a type of server on VLAN 10, right? But if you have a private VLAN, even though all of those servers are on the same subnet, on the same VLAN, they cannot talk to each other. So if you have the HR lady who has to have Java on her workstation because she's using some shitty ADP app, and she gets hit with the drive-by download, she cannot propagate and infect all of those other workstations on the private VLAN. Free in Cisco. Use it. Huge, huge security benefit. Now, you do have to have certain things, and they're called promiscuous VLANs, so like file servers and things like that. But I would even say for your file server, going back to the nerdy CISSP, it's the combination of not using the same operating systems, so they're not vulnerable to the same exploits. So if you can have an NFS file server that's running an AV system to scan for viruses that maybe your end users pick up, but the file server itself is not going to be vulnerable, that's a really great way to do things. And Linux is free. Save yourself a Windows license. It doesn't take that much to set up an NFS export on a Linux box. Talk about VMware. Independent and non-persistent disks, web servers with MD5 hash logging to a remote server. I personally use Snare. It's free. And using PowerCLI, which is an extension of PowerShell, to connect to the vCenter server. Now I'm going to explain to you how this works. And this is something I came up with. I think it's awesome. I will be happy to go toe-to-toe with any pen tester that wants to breach my lab network. I'll take you up on it. I'm going to show you how it works. So you have firewall. It could be a firewall. We happen to use a WAF as well, okay? But I would say firewall is fine. You have your web farm. On our web farm, we have load balanced servers, right? We happen to use a specific vendor. It can check to make sure that the Apache process is running, and it will take servers dynamically in and out of the load balance pool when it sees one goes offline. This is important. Also have a process. You could write it in Python. It could be a bash script. However you want to do it. It takes MD5s of all the critical files on our web farm, because if you have web-facing services and you're delivering content, mostly you're worried about availability and integrity. Not really worried about confidentiality if you have a public-facing website. Okay? You could be creative. You could use OSEC. We actually use OSEC in our environment as well. What happens, MD5s are calculated every X minutes. It could be 5, it could be 10, it could be however paranoid you want it to be. MD5s are shipped over to a logging and response server. MD5s are compared. This is a Windows server. I grew up in a Windows environment, and I love PowerShell and PowerCLI. It plays very nicely with VMware. There is a concept of a non-persistent disk in VMware. How many times or how much should the data here be changing in an N-tier architecture? Yes, not hardly ever. Only when you patch, right? So everybody's moving to the cloud anyway. Everybody wants to deploy servers as quickly as possible. You run with this concept. So in our environment, we can spin up web servers very quickly. You can deploy them from template and get them online almost immediately. So you get your first web server exactly how you want it. You know it's in a clean and pristine state. You take MD5s of all the files.